Imagine a crime so vast it drained nearly $15 billion from the pockets of American taxpayers, specifically targeting the programs designed to protect our most vulnerable, our seniors, veterans, and the sick. This wasn't a bank heist. This was a criminal enterprise engineered with, well, with military-level precision, operating for years, hiding in plain sight within the bureaucracy of our own healthcare system. And here is the core shock. To fuel this racket, over 1 million Americans had their medical identities, their social security numbers, their diagnoses, their entire life details stolen and leveraged by foreign criminal cartels. This wasn't just a failure of accounting. This was a sophisticated, coordinated, and intentional corruption, allegedly protected for years by political blind spots. The very system built to care for you was weaponized to rob you blind. Stay with us as we break this down in our in-depth discussion right here on News Focus Podcast. And if you find our reporting valuable, please hit the like button and subscribe to support our channel. I truly appreciate it. Welcome to the deep dive. What we witnessed this week, it wasn't a routine enforcement sweep. Not at all. This was a federal intervention that landed with the force of a tectonic shift. It spanned multiple states, involved nearly every federal agency, and targeted international criminal hubs. The Department of Justice stepped forward to announce Operation Gold Rush, which they officially deemed the largest healthcare fraud bust in American history. When you just look at the figures, the gravity of that claim, the largest ever, it's almost hard to grasp.
It absolutely is. And the sheer magnitude of this operation is why it's being called, a political and fiscal bombshell. The DOJ confirmed 324 arrests directly linked to this sprawling network.
324.
Right. And the headline number, that $14.6 to $15 billion range in fraudulent claims. That figure represents money that was successfully extracted from Medicare and Medicaid, often in plain sight over a substantial period of time.
So this wasn't an isolated incident?
No, not at all. This was an established, almost institutionalized drain on public funds.
Let's unpack this immediately, because the question isn't just how much was stolen, but how a scheme of this colossal size avoided detection for so long. Federal investigators, they didn't just find sloppy corruption. They found an operation designed specifically to neutralize oversight.
Now, that's where this concept of systemic engineering becomes so crucial. The architects of this fraud, they understood that the U.S. healthcare system, particularly federal programs like Medicare, is a labyrinth of staggering complexity.
Amazed.
Exactly. So instead of trying to sneak small crimes past simple audits, they built the fraud into the complexity itself. They created layer after layer of paperwork using sophisticated networks of interconnected shell companies designed to look legitimate on paper. And in doing so, they deliberately overwhelmed the auditors.
Can you elaborate on what those layers look like? I mean, how does a shell company designed for fraud even differ from a legitimate business on paper?
Well, a legitimate provider, it registers locally, it serves a community, it has a clear ownership structure. These fraud networks were far more advanced. They established hundreds of corporations, often registered in multiple states at the same time.
Giving them a national look.
Precisely. They'd use these generic professional-sounding titles like National Medical Supply or Community Diagnostics. And if you tried to follow the ownership trail, it would often lead to another shell company, then maybe to an anonymous trust, and then eventually right across an international border.
It's a dead end.
It's a series of dead ends. This structure, combined with these intricate cross-border payment routes, often involving complex foreign exchange transactions or even the use of crypto gateways, it ensured that by the time an auditor reached one of those dead ends, the money was already laundered and funneled into overseas accounts.
Making it virtually impossible to claw back.
Through any conventional means, yes. The sheer volume of this fake administrative data was, in fact, their greatest defense.
So the complexity itself was the operational shield. They didn't need to be invisible. They just needed to be too complicated to follow, which perfectly exploits the slow, manual processes of standard bureaucracy.
Precisely. It was an automated machine. An ordinary auditor, looking at just one transaction for, say, $50,000, would follow that paper trail for weeks.
And find nothing.
Find themselves stalled at a registered address that was just a P.O. box, or confronting ownership documents leading to a non-existent entity overseas. Now multiply that by thousands of claims across dozens of companies and the standard oversight mechanism, it just collapses under the weight.
The fraud was engineered to operate above the audit capacity of the federal government.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Let's detail the material that was on this fraud menu, because these criminals didn't just bill for, Band-Aids. They focused on high-value items, targeting the most profitable gaps in the system with what the DOJ described as military-level precision.
They absolutely did. They targeted high-value, durable medical equipment, or DME. These are often things that are complex and expensive, like motorized wheelchairs, high-end orthopedic braces, or specialized respiratory equipment.
Things that come with a big price tag from Medicare.
A very big price tag. For example, a common scheme involved billing Medicare for thousands of customized knee or back braces. But these were either phantom devices, they were never even created, or at best they were cheap, off-the-shelf items that were billed at thousands of dollars as custom-fitted.
And they also staged procedures.
Yes, procedures that were never performed, and they used highly specific billing codes designed to trigger massive, quick reimbursements from the system.
When we talk about these codes, are these standard procedure codes that are simply being misused, or are they finding some obscure niche codes that lack sufficient regulatory scrutiny?
It's a combination of both, actually. They weren't inventing codes from scratch. They were mastering the obscure ones.
Mm.
You see, every medical procedure, every supply, it has a corresponding current procedural terminology code, a CPT code.
Right.
The criminals focused on codes that are either inherently high cost or codes that, when you pair them together, suggest a level of necessary complexity that auditors are often trained to just wave through.
So they gamed the system's logic.
They did. They created these synthetic patient profiles that perfectly matched the documentation required for these high-value phantom services, making the claims look entirely legitimate on first inspection. It was a simulation of legitimate billing, perfected through data analysis.
It's just chilling to think that a criminal cartel understood the intricacies of the CPT manual better than a legitimate small-town clinic. Now, let's move to the point that started the whole takedown. You mentioned this massive camouflaged criminal engine was undone not by a massive leak, but by a small irregularity. How did this $15 billion web finally begin to unravel?
It's a classic case of the little thread leading to the giant tapestry. The investigators, they confirmed the operation didn't begin with a high-level whistleblower or a major data breach. It was a single routine data verification check buried deep within the layers of Medicare billing. An auditor flagged a claim where the billing code, let's say for a complex diabetes monitor, it just didn't align logically with the patient's existing documented medical history, which showed only a non-diabetic condition like, say, acute back pain.
So the mismatch wasn't necessarily proof of fraud on its own, but it was proof of an administrative error significant enough to warrant a second look.
Precisely. It was a statistical anomaly, one small claim that deviated from the norm.
And they pulled on that thread.
They pulled that thread, and they found the provider was linked to 10 other providers, all of whom had similar illogical claim patterns. Then, those 10 providers led to 50 shell companies, and those shell companies led to the hundreds of duplicate identities.
Wow.
This single data inconsistency, this one deviation from the statistically expected profile of a legitimate claim, that was the first domino. It proves that even the most massive automated criminal schemes, when they're relying on thousands of human data inputs, will eventually produce an error that data analysis can spot.
Provided the mandate is there to look for it.
That's the key. The mandate has to be there.
So the system designed to hide in the complexity was ultimately undone by a simple, verifiable fact. It's an encouraging, yet also terrifying lesson in oversight.
It's an essential distinction to make. The complexity of the fraud was its defense, but the reliance on real patients' data, even stolen data, means there is always a tangible link to reality. The system can repel a manual audit, but it cannot repel algorithmic data verification when it is properly targeted.
Okay, let's pivot to the architects of this crime, because this was not a domestic phenomenon. The core finding of Operation Gold Rush was the revelation that this entire system was backed, controlled, and financed by foreign criminal networks.
And this elevates the crime from simple financial fraud to a matter of deep institutional infiltration. The Department of Justice confirmed that the key ringleaders and the organizational masterminds were based in critical foreign hubs: Russia, Eastern Europe, Pakistan, and various other international locations known for sophisticated cyber and financial crime.
And what's so crucial to understand here is that these individuals weren't just exploiting technical vulnerabilities.
No, they had gained an almost encyclopedic knowledge of U.S. healthcare bureaucracy.
It's a strange paradox, isn't it? Foreign criminal syndicates understanding U.S. Medicare reimbursement codes better than most Americans. How did they acquire that level of institutional expertise?
It really speaks to the sophistication of modern transnational crime. They often purchase this knowledge. They recruit or, bribe insiders, disgruntled or compromised data specialists, billing consultants, or regulatory experts.
They treat knowledge as an asset.
As a critical business asset, yes. These groups weren't just running generic scams. They employed complex data modeling to identify specific high-yield Medicare codes that had minimal auditing risk. They figured out where the bureaucratic blind spots were, and they set up their infrastructure to exploit them systematically.
And their business model was predicated on camouflage. Explain how they used these legitimate-looking U.S. medical supply companies as their primary fronts.
These fronts were critical because they gave the fraudulent claims a veneer of domestic legitimacy. The foreign masterminds quietly acquired or established hundreds of shell companies on U.S. soil. They would often purchase existing, small but maybe struggling legitimate medical practices or supply companies,
And use their history.
and use that established tax ID and history as a launchpad. They operated these firms through layers of straw owners and fake corporate identities, carefully generating thousands of claims, ensuring no single entity billed enough to trigger immediate high-level federal scrutiny.
So the goal was to steal U.S. taxpayer money while keeping the financial profits safely outside the reach of U.S. courts. How did they manage the cross-border money laundering once the funds left Medicare?
They employed very sophisticated financial countermeasures. Once the funds were reimbursed into the U.S.-based shell company accounts, they were rapidly dispersed. They utilized what are called money mules for smaller transfers, but for the billions, they relied on complex high-velocity wire transfers, often disguised as payments for non-existent international consulting services or technology licenses.
A digital paper trail designed to confuse.
And a significant portion was moved through offshore financial institutions in jurisdictions with weak transparency laws. Investigators also noted an increasing use of cryptocurrencies to quickly move massive sums across borders, which makes the digital trail instantly fragmented and incredibly difficult to trace. The profits were then funneled into assets like luxury real estate, yachts, and vehicles in these foreign hubs.
That brings us to the most devastating aspect of Operation Gold Rush, the human cost. Beyond the financial theft, over 1 million Americans had their identities stolen to fuel this fraud machine.
1 million identities. That number should shock every single person listening, because it represents not just stolen money, but a complete obliteration of personal data security for individuals across all 50 states.
All 50 states.
Yes, we're talking about real people, seniors relying on Medicare Part D, veterans, parents, and critically, people battling serious chronic illnesses like cancer, whose highly sensitive medical histories and financial identification details were co-opted.
What are the long-term consequences for these victims? It's more than just a ruined credit score, isn't it?
Oh, it's far more damaging than standard financial identity theft. When your medical identity is compromised, criminals use your name, your social security number, and your Medicare ID to bill for phantom procedures. This creates an entirely fraudulent medical history under your name.
A ghost history.
A ghost history. And victims might suddenly find themselves flagged in system databases for receiving treatments they never had, which can lead to denied claims for legitimate future procedures, incorrect prescriptions being issued, or huge complications with insurance coverage based on fabricated pre-existing conditions. It shatters their trust in the healthcare system and imposes a nightmarish bureaucratic tangle that can take years, if not decades, to resolve.
So the system failed to protect the data, and then it used the very data that was stolen to harm the victim financially and medically.
Exactly. And the methods used to acquire 1 million legitimate identities, they really highlight the systemic security flaws. The criminal groups employed a multi-pronged strategy. They actively bought massive, hijacked data sets on the dark web data, often harvested from past corporate breaches. They also exploited outdated hospital software, which many small and rural hospitals still use, that lacked modern encryption standards, making it very easy to scrape large volumes of patient data.
But the truly insidious part, I think, involves the insiders.
Absolutely. The investigation pointed directly to the failure of third-party contractors. Hospitals and federal programs, they rely heavily on outside companies, clearinghouses, billing services, claims processors to handle the massive administrative load.
And they all have access.
They often have access to huge amounts of sensitive patient data. Investigators believe these criminal organizations either successfully hacked these third-party systems or, and this is more disturbing, outright bribed individuals within these companies to hand over huge lists containing real names, real SSNs, and active medical policy numbers.
So the system failed because it handed the keys to the data kingdom over to compromised third parties.
When you look at the total failure rate, 1 million compromised social security numbers, It stops being about a loophole, and it becomes about a fundamental structural weakness in how we secure our most sensitive information.
It speaks to a decade-long national security vulnerability.
It does. We have treated patient data security as a regulatory burden rather than a critical defense perimeter. And foreign actors recognized that the financial reward for infiltrating this system was immense, and the risk of detection, until recently, was negligible.
Now we have to move from financial theft and identity fraud to outright human cruelty, because the Operation Gold Rush indictments detail schemes that cross the line into physical exploitation, specifically focusing on unnecessary medical procedures.
This is truly the most morally reprehensible part of the entire story. Investigators focused heavily on a highly profitable branch of the fraud, one revolving around unnecessary amniotic skin graft procedures.
For our listeners, what exactly is an amniotic skin graft, and why did it become such a high-value target for fraudsters?
An amniotic skin graft is a highly specialized medical product, often derived from human placental tissue. They are legitimately used to treat chronic, non-healing wounds, severe burns, or diabetic ulcers. They are miracle tools when they're actually needed, but they are incredibly expensive.
And under Medicare?
Under Medicare, these grafts often receive extremely high reimbursement rates, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars per application, because they're considered cutting edge and necessary for serious conditions.
And the fraudsters figured out how to turn this legitimate high-cost therapy into a high-volume scam.
Precisely. They exploited the high reimbursement code. They weren't just phantom billing, though that happened too. They were actively pushing these grafts onto patients who did not need them, or fabricating conditions that supposedly required them. The fraud crossed from merely stealing money to outright medical abuse.
And who are the targets of this specific grotesque exploitation?
The targets were meticulously chosen for their vulnerability. Fraudsters focused on elderly patients, often those in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, or those battling advanced chronic illnesses like severe diabetes or dementia.
Why were those groups specifically sought out?
Because they are the least likely to question unusual paperwork, ask complex medical questions, or notice a subtle change in their care routine. In many of these cases, the seniors were too sick, too confused, or they lacked the necessary cognitive capacity to provide informed consent.
Unbelievable.
Investigators confirmed that some clinics were pushing multiple aggressive skin graft applications on seniors who were not only confused but also physically frail, simply because the reimbursement code was so lucrative. In the most shocking cases, the facility would bill Medicare for the graft and then just throw the expensive material away, using the patient's identity and medical condition to justify the massive reimbursement without ever applying the treatment.
That is a staggering level of moral detachment, using a patient's physical vulnerability as a tool for financial gain. The system, once again, was used against the very people it was designed to protect.
And this exploitation wasn't just limited to foreign actors exploiting U.S. data. This scheme required significant participation from medical insiders. The Department of Justice charged 74 licensed medical professionals, including doctors, pharmacists, and clinic owners, who had, in essence, chosen organized crime over their Hippocratic oath.
Let's focus on the role they played, particularly in feeding the opioid crisis. These medical professionals were essentially operating pill mills, billing Medicare to fund addiction.
That is exactly what they were doing. These clinics were pure distribution centers masquerading as medical facilities. They would bill Medicare and Medicaid for medically unnecessary visits, often charging high rates for brief consultations where the only purpose was to generate a prescription for high-value narcotics.
So they were leveraging the opioid crisis as a guaranteed stream of income.
Yes. The addicted patients became, in the terminology used by investigators, disposable income streams used to trigger the reimbursement codes.
So these doctors and pharmacists were not treating addiction. They were banking on it, using the system to ensure repeat business for their illicit prescription scheme.
It was calculated financial exploitation of human suffering. They knowingly contributed to families being torn apart, rising overdoses, and community devastation, all while billing the government for their supposed treatment. It's an intentional internal betrayal of public trust that shows how institutional ethics can completely collapse when massive financial incentives are introduced. This demonstrates the critical connection between pure financial crime and the broader public health catastrophes we see unfolding nationally.
As the federal agencies prepared to execute Operation Gold Rush, the criminal networks knew the game was up. There was an immediate and frantic rush among the key ringleaders to flee the country. And that movement, it speaks volumes about their confidence in the political shield that had previously protected them.
The collapse was sudden and chaotic for the cartels. When that aggressive oversight mandate shifted and the first arrests started happening quietly, the inner circle immediately recognized that their previous protections were gone. Investigators confirmed intercepting multiple suspects at major U.S. international airports, either already having boarded or preparing to board private jets or long-haul international commercial flights,
And their destinations.
often destined for those foreign hubs we discussed earlier: Russia, Pakistan, Eastern Europe.
And others were attempting to flee via land routes, correct?
Yes. Several high-value individuals were apprehended attempting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border at high speed just as the indictments were being unsealed. The timing was critical. They were running because the impunity they had enjoyed for years had vanished overnight.
And this level of panic, it just proved their guilt.
It proved their guilt and their reliance on a system that had previously allowed them to operate without fear of accountability.
And what were the agents seizing in these frantic last-minute flight attempts? This detail often paints the clearest picture of the scale of the corruption.
The seizures were almost cinematic, detailing the vast spoils of their crime. Agents intercepted suspects carrying suitcases stuffed with hundreds of thousands of dollars in bundled, untraceable cash.
Just suitcases of cash.
Yes, they found high-end, luxury watches, Patek Philippe, Rolex, often in multiple quantities, along with keys and titles to exotic vehicles and documents proving ownership of global properties purchased exclusively with the stolen taxpayer money. This wasn't petty theft. This was the financial infrastructure of a well-established, global organized crime syndicate that believed they could simply liquidate assets and disappear.
That brings us to the political infrastructure that shielded them. Because these sophisticated schemes, they don't survive for years simply by being complex. They require a political or regulatory environment that resists scrutiny.
That is the essential scandal buried beneath the billing fraud. The investigation strongly suggested that the fraud survived for years because whenever auditors, regulators, or reform-minded lawmakers attempted to implement transparency measures or mandate deeper audits, they were met with organized political resistance.
How is that resistance typically framed?
It was masterful political camouflage. Lawmakers who opposed aggressive oversight would frame the efforts as attacking healthcare.
Attacking healthcare.
Yes, suggesting that audits and transparency requirements would burden legitimate providers, slow down payments, or crucially defund essential programs serving the vulnerable. They used the complexity of Medicare and Medicaid, the very same complexity the fraudsters exploited, as a rhetorical shield, arguing that the system had to be protected from intrusive government oversight to maintain service levels.
So, in essence, they convinced the public that asking basic questions about a multi-trillion-dollar system was somehow detrimental to patient care.
Absolutely. The complexity was the shield, and political resistance was the log on the door. This created enormous bureaucratic blind spots. These criminal cartels, they relied on the political consensus that deep, intrusive audits were too costly, too disruptive, or simply too politically toxic to pursue. They understood that if the money flowed fast enough and the administrative paperwork was complex enough, the political will to stop them would just vanish.
So if that political resistance was so entrenched, what was the catalyst for the system's collapse now? Why did the political shield finally vanish?
There was a fundamental shift in the federal mandate regarding accountability. The Department of Justice and other enforcement agencies were empowered by a new, what they termed, an aggressive oversight philosophy. This changed the rules of engagement for investigators. They instituted a clear, non-negotiable directive. No more blind spots, no more off-limit zones, and no more sacred cows.
What did that change practically entail for the investigators on the ground?
It meant that every subcontractor, every shell company, and every statistically anomalous billing pattern was suddenly subject to intense, weaponized scrutiny. They increased funding for the Medicare Fraud Strike Force, they invested in advanced data analysis tools, and critically, they fostered deep cross-agency collaboration, something that was previously bureaucratic quicksand.
So they broke down the silos.
They did. And when this audit-everything approach was deployed, the fraud machine's entire defense mechanism evaporated. The cartels realized they could no longer rely on politics or bureaucracy to insulate them. The era of protection was definitively over, which triggered the mass panic and the attempts to flee.
Let's synthesize the broader implications of Operation Gold Rush because, as we said at the start, this is not just a crime story. This is a fiscal and structural earthquake running through the core of American infrastructure.
It forces a national reckoning about the structural integrity of our $5 trillion healthcare system. The financial fallout will be enormous. Federal agencies are now aggressively working to claw back billions of dollars in assets and cash, a process that will be protracted and complex due to the money laundering methods they employed. Furthermore, dozens of third-party contractors, those that were either compromised or shown to have inadequate security, will likely lose all federal access, leading to a massive reorganization in healthcare administration.
And crucially, the systems themselves have to change. The fact that the CPT codes were so easily exploited means the rules have to be rewritten, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This bust provides undeniable evidence that entire sections of the reimbursement manual need to be revisited, simplified, and hardened against exploitation. This scandal will likely trigger a massive overhaul, rewriting key reimbursement codes and implementing immediate automated data verification checks to prevent the replication of these specific fraud schemes, especially those involving DME and high-cost procedures like the skin grafts.
Politically, the narrative has fundamentally changed. The arguments used to resist audits, framing them as attacks on healthcare, have been completely invalidated by the exposure of a $15 billion criminal operation.
It mandates accountability. Lawmakers who previously obstructed oversight now face intense scrutiny. This event proves, incontrovertibly, that aggressive oversight is not an attack on the system, but a fundamental necessity to protect public funds and public health. This scandal forces Washington to confront the reality that they allowed foreign criminal networks to systematically fleece the American taxpayer for years due to regulatory inertia and allegedly political interference.
That leads us to the bigger, more ominous picture. If the system, with all its checks and balances, missed a $15 billion automated fraud machine operating with 1 million stolen identities over the course of years, what else has been overlooked?
That is the essential question that remains unanswered, and it goes to the heart of systemic vulnerability. The immense complexity of our federal programs, the layers of subcontractors, the massive data flows, the reliance on third-party processes, this is what enabled these foreign networks to operate virtually untouched for so long.
So Gold Rush is just the tip of the iceberg.
Well, while Operation Gold Rush was the largest bust in history, it exposed deep structural cracks not just in enforcement, but in the very foundation of how these programs are designed and guarded. We have to assume that other, smaller, less centralized fraud schemes are still operating, lurking in the shadows of the complexity. This bust is not the end of the cleanup. It is merely the beginning of excavating what was truly buried beneath the surface.
And as this national reckoning begins, the goal is clear: to rebuild a system that works for the American people, not for the criminals, the corrupt bureaucrats, or the foreign networks intent on siphoning our money. The scandal isn't the end. It's only the very beginning of the accountability Washington never expected to face.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
And thank you to our listeners.
That's all for this episode of News Focus Podcast. But it leaves us with one haunting question. If investigators uncovered a $15 billion fraud machine using 1 million stolen identities, what structural vulnerabilities still remain, hidden by complexity, ready for the next cartel to exploit?